the DNR Water Appropriations Program, that's also an EWR, but that's a different permit program. And then the dam safety program, so that's basically when you have a high hazard dam, that's a different program. And then the last two bullets are, the wetland areas that are not public waters, or the wetland fringes of public waters located above the OHWL are regulated under Wetlands Conservation Act. And the shoreline areas above the OHW are administered by the local government units under their shoreline ordinance. And then here's a list of things that are covered under a permit program. I'm not going to read all those. Most of you probably know we have an online permit application system. It's called MPARS. That's where we apply for permits. And then I just put in here, sometimes I forget about environmental review because there's another unit in my DNR, Ecological and Water Resources, which manages DNR environmental reviews. And so we can't issue a public waters work permit for a project that's undergoing an environmental review until the environmental review process is complete. So a permit can be applied for, but we can't issue the permit until, because the whole concept is that the environmental review should be informing the permit process, like potential conditions or limits, or even possibly denying the permit. And so it doesn't you're kind of getting ahead of the process to issue a permit before the environmental review process is done. And here's some of the types of projects, and you guys probably work on lots of these. The kind of common types of projects that require a public waters work permit that undergo environmental review. So, and there's more, but those are kind of common ones. And then I wanted to, just getting towards the end, I wanted to just mention a little bit about, buffer law, the OHW, and normal water level. So the buffer law says the width of a buffer must be measured from the top or crown of the bank. Where there is no definable bank, measurement must begin from the edge of the normal water level. So really what that's saying is from a lake or wetland, where there's no, because there's no definable bank with a lake or a wetland, measurement must begin from the edge of the normal water level. So, and then there's a definition of normal water level. And if you read that definition, it's different than OHW. And so, so kind of the take-home point is that the definition of OHW and normal water level are similar, and they might lead you to the same point on the landscape, but they're not the same definition. And this and Bowser, so they're the agency, the Board of Water and Soil Resources. They, they basically kind of oversee the soil and water conservation districts, and so, and so they have the bigger role. The DNR doesn't have any role in administration or enforcement of the buffer law. Our role was to create the buffer map. And then Bowser, working with the SWCDs and the counties for drainage ditches, are responsible for enforcement and implementation. And one of the little tricky things that Bowser's kind of worked with the DNR on is, the shoreline ordinance that we talked about before has required a buffer on public waters since day one, right? And so it says public waters must require under their shoreline standard in agricultural areas. But the shoreline ordinance it's the locals are administering that. Most of them weren't requiring buffers. There is several counties that did, Dakota counties, kind of a showcase. I don't mean to exclude anybody. There are several, half a dozen counties out of 87 that were doing a really good job enforcing the buffer standard in the shoreline ordinance. But the rest of the counties were just kind of ignoring it because of the local angst would be so high, if they just decided to do that, that the county commissioners would probably get voted out or whatever. So part of the purpose of the buffer law was to give more weight to, we have to implement buffers, but the buffer law also says it has to be, public waters, 50-foot buffer, minimum 30-foot, average 50-foot. The shoreline ordinance has different language. The shoreline ordinance refers to OHW. It has different width criteria. The buffer law refers to normal water law. And so there has to been some work through, Bowser's developed some model ordinances working with the DNR for the locals to adopt to help them navigate through these different definitions. And so, some of you who might be working on, buffer implementation will kind of understand the nuances here with that discussion. I don't know if you guys normally distribute presentations, but I had some links there of things that I referred to. If there's time, I had a couple more scenarios we could talk through. Is there time for me to go a couple more, or do you want to wait till Q&A? Should I just proceed? Okay, so this will just maybe take 5 minutes. So another example of where it might be, where this is a question I got a lot from, kind of related to buffer, where do we put a buffer? So in this situation, what you're looking at here is you see the stream, that's Walker Brook, that's in Clearwater County, that by Bagley, and what you see is it's a public water course, but you can also see, hopefully, I'm almost kind of working here. It has a big wetland fringe around that water course. Now, that wetland is not a public water wetland. So if you look at the PWI map, all that you'd see is a water course line tracing Walker Brook, basically. And so then the question would come up, well, where's Top of Bank Jack? You can't even get to it. You'd sink it over your head in muck. Is that a term you guys use a lot on your wetlands? So in peat, you'd be up over your head in liquid peat. And so you can't ever get to that. I did my thesis work on this stream, which is kind of why I put it up here. It's almost impossible to get to the actual where the water flows. And so there's really no bank there, like, that other picture I showed before in the ag setting, there's really no bank there, so, where do we measure the buffer from? And, which is really, where's the OHW? And so, what I'd say is the OHW is basically right where you see the water flowing. It's going to be right where that stream is, where you see the flow concentrated, the stream signature. And so in a setting like this, the rest of that wetland and forest, is buffering that stream. So nobody needs to do any buffer in that area, like do anything special. It's already being buffered. The question would come up, so in comparison, is if sometimes you have a public water course flow through a public water wetland, so it's a wetland complex. And I'll hold that, I have an example of that, I think. So here's the same thing, and so this is a LiDAR-derived product that the DNR created. We call it HPI, which stands for Hydrologic Power Index, and it's a whole talk on how this was derived. But basically what it does is it helps the water flow features pop out and elevation differences. So you can see kind of the channel of Walker Brook flowing through, and you can really see, the area of red is all basically equal elevation. And so you can really see that that's just a broad valley. You have a little stream flowing through it. And so again, the OHW would be where you see the stream signature, not way off on the edge of that, on the valley, which is its floodplain. Here's another example from my days as area hydro. So this is 6 Mile Marsh, which is, and 6 Mile Creek, which is a tributary into Lake Minnetonka in Minnetrista area. And the green polygon is 6 Mile Marsh, which is a public water wetland. And then it flows into Halstead's Bay of Lake Minnetonka, right where it turns blue there. And so you have 6 Mile Creek, 6 Mile Marsh, and Lake Minnetonka shown in that picture, 3 different public waters. And so in this case, again, the public water, you have a public water course flowing through a public water wetland. So in this case, the OHW for the stream doesn't really matter, because if somebody's gonna do a project in this area, they're gonna have to stay out of the wetland, out of 6 Mile Marsh. And so it's gonna be, what's the OHW of 6 Mile Marsh is what's gonna kind of influence if a permit's required or not. It doesn't really matter what it is for the stream. And then in this case, so you can see, again, like the first example, the stream requires a buffer under our buffer law, but the wetland, even though it's a public water, it doesn't require a buffer because the buffer, it was decided that public water wetlands that don't have a shoreline classification don't require a buffer. So in this case, it doesn't, the 6 Mile Marsh serves as the buffer for 6 Mile Creek, and in most of those cases, there might be, this little pinch point right up there. There might be a little buffer, required there. Okay, so that was all I was planning to present. So did we, yeah.
I guess the one question that I had was, when they made the public water inventory maps, it seems like there was intent, and maybe the intent was to protect the fish lakes, the lakes deeper than 15 feet in depth, and maybe the intent was to, protect those waterfall nesting habitats, or type 3, 4, and 5 wetlands over 10 acres in size, or 2.5 within municipal areas. Kind of the shallow lakes, 6 to 15 feet in depth. And I think in a certain sense, sometimes I've had a couple of projects where the whole wetland got changed to a shrub swamp, and then you're just sitting there going, well, this doesn't really fit anymore, and we're trying to do this project. And so sometimes I think it'd be helpful to have the intent, the rule, maybe a little bit more emphasized. And then, with regard to the buffer, the buffer program, to say that it's where hydrophytic vegetation or hydric soil, I kind of think you maybe ought to just have hydrophytic vegetation and analysis, because a lot of times you see the hydric soil going, I guess, to a higher level than where you begin to see the hydrology affecting the hydric soil to create enough wet habitat, for the hydrophytic vegetation. So that, say in a hydrophytic vegetation or hydric soils is a little bit questionable, putting them in the same category, for determining a normal water. That's just my opinion, so.
Right, and, we don't make, so regarding the definition of normal water level, that the legislature came up with that definition, and my understanding is that they kind of went behind closed doors and came out a couple hours later with a buffer law. So there maybe wasn't a lot of the normal vetting and review by affected agencies on coming up with some of this. I do know it was kind of purpose not to use OHW because that's kind of too abstract.
Right.
as kind of the starting point for the buffers. So it would really require a rule change, or I did link to the Bowser guidance. Like the guidance might expand on it a little bit. I don't know if you've read that, but that might provide some information that might put you at ease a little. I don't know, might, you know, when they elaborate on it.
Sure.
As far as public waters, that's really, you know, that's kind of a common complaint, is we have a public water that doesn't, right today, it doesn't meet the definition of a public water. We don't have the statutory authority to remove those from the public waters inventory. You know, we probably wouldn't seek that kind of authority, because what it does is it helps potentially preserve the potential for restoration of some of these features. Now, sometimes that might just not be, you know, at all possible. But, you know, if these were just taken off, I mean, which we can't do anyway, but we probably wouldn't advocate for them, because then, but at least now they're being somewhat protected, even though they might not meet the definition. But if once we say, oh, no, you can do, you know, it, we could, well, it kind of depends on, we could reclassify it so that it would be managed under WACA, but we have to be careful about that too, because sometimes WACA allows things that we don't under public water work rules, and we're not supposed to do that if it lowers the protection level. So anyway, yep. Yeah.
Two questions. Do you see the existing hard maps, you know, the old PWI maps, being digitized at some point in the future? And secondly, can you use the buffer maps as a substitute to demonstrate PWI water?
Good question. So the first question about, we have that blob map that I showed, and those were actually produced as hard copies and mailed to each county, and you know, you could still order them, I think, somewhere from Minnesota Library or something if you wanted hard copies of that. Whereas there hasn't been a similar effort done to create hard copies using, you know, the digitized layer. We do have about 15 maybe counties that were done, you know, about 5-10 years, probably 10 years ago, that were digitized. What happened is that, you know, that effort kind of had some momentum, and then what happened is as kind of GIS systems became more prevalent out, you know, kind of everywhere, like with, you know, your local government units and consulting companies, then the demand for the paper map just kind of, we hardly ever hear anybody asking us for a digitized version, paper copy of that map. So we don't have any plans to continue with those, trying to create those. You know, a lot of, you know, I know when I was, I think a lot of counties are similar, where when I was area hydro for Carver County, you know, they had the public waters inventory, and, you know, available right as part of their own property database, and so they could print off, you know, they could print maps that showed all of those public waters using, you know, it was a digital generated map, and so I think that kind of ability kind of reduced the demand. And then your question about the buffer map, can the buffer map be used as kind of a proxy for the public water? You really can't, because for two reasons. One, like I said, the buffer, public water wetlands without a shoreline classification don't require a buffer. So those public waters aren't on the buffer map. So you'd be missing a lot of wetlands right away. The other thing that we've done is, you know, how I've said we're limited in what we can take off the public waters inventory. We're not as restricted about what we can take off the buffer map. So we have a lot of scenarios out there where out on the landscape where you might have a water course that was tiled, or it's being farmed, you know, where there's really no channel anymore, but it's on the public water. You know, and if you look back, it was proper at the time, you know, it's on the USGS quad, it was proper at the time of the inventory, probably, to include it. And so we've removed, it's kind of based on a review of, somebody asking us, hey, is this really, do we really have to, where do we put the buffer? There's no channel here. So there's been a process in place to review those, and we've removed, several hundred segments of water courses from the buffer map. And so those are still public waters, technically, but you wouldn't see visibility of those on the buffer map either.
Regarding the hydrographic survey that this work, how or what kinds of criteria does the DNR use when assessing whether or not a formal determination is called for? And then in those situations where it is called for, how is that work prioritized?
Good question. It's, usually, I don't know that we have set criteria for when we do that, so I'm kind of trying to think of what the process might be. Lots of times it's when there's a project where really, it might be a big project and it might really matter. Just somebody, pointing on the ground might not be good enough, right? You really need to know. I can think of one example in the last couple of years where, let's see if I can go back here. So if you take this case right here, this might even have been an example where it wasn't clear if this was part of the public water or not. The landowners, the people who own this, they wanted to put a road, they wanted to fill in here and put a road over that. And our rules wouldn't allow it, but WACA would. And so in that case, it was we were thinking this is part of that, but in order to, it was gonna probably, you have these, dominoes kinda on these, somebody wanted to do a development here, and they needed road access here for some reason, some county rule or something. And if we didn't if they couldn't have a road here, they weren't gonna be able to develop this property, put 3 houses on it or whatever it is that they wanted to do. I don't remember all the details. So in that case, we requested a survey crew to go out and do an OHW. And so, it would be an example of where we wouldn't ask the survey crew is if it's just for the purpose of a land use program setback. If somebody's just wondering okay, this guy here, or wherever it is, I think that might be part of the wetland. So they were proposing some kind of development here. They want to develop here, and they're wondering, there isn't an OHW determined for this. They're wondering, well, where do we show the structure? Where can they build the structure? We would say, you county or city, you can go out, you can just tell them, because they have to do a site plan, topography. You can just tell them, at that edge, you can tell them where you think that edge is and 50 feet back from there. So we wouldn't need an OHW in that case, a survey one. As far as our process to get once we decide, yeah, we want a survey, the area hydro actually has to fill out a requisition that's stating the reason for why it needs to be done, and then their supervisor needs to approve it, and then it goes into the queue for the survey crew, and it's one crew, and so they're kind of in high demand. So I don't know exactly how they prioritize their work. I think sometimes what they're doing is they're trying to just group things geographically. So say they're gonna be on the road for a week doing some, they'll maybe try to pick up an extra survey or two along the way, if they're gonna be going right by it. They can be pretty labor intensive though too, so it's not uncommon to have to wait 6-9 months for them to do a survey. And then sometimes we actually have meetings where we talk about, do we need, we talk about when you decide. There might be a conversation between like myself, the area hydrologist, their supervisor, the head of the survey, the supervisor of the survey crew, and we might all talk about, do we need to do an OHW survey here, pros and cons. We generally don't like to do them if there's been one done before. I don't know if that was satisfied here.
Great, if anybody else has any questions, let's just hold them for the end so that the court can, in their talk to on how they define waterways in section 4.4. Thank you.
Well, this was the best.
All right, before I get started, I do want to say Chad was really bummed that he couldn't come today. He was so excited about this, and then like a last minute conflict arose on Monday, and he's really bummed. He even came by my office today to bemoan his terrible luck. So today Leslie and I are going to talk a little bit about our program, which I think generally when people think about the Corps, they think about the Clean Water Act only. But I do want to remind you that there's actually two laws predominantly that we operate under. The Rivers and Harbors Act, which Tributaries and Waterways, we talk about under that, as well as the Clean Water Act. Okay. So a lot of times you hear the Corps, we talk about jurisdiction, but when we use that term, for us, that actually means two different things. We have something called geographic jurisdiction, which is the actual physical feature on the landscape under which we would be asserting one of our regulatory authorities, or both. And then we have activity-specific jurisdiction, which is then the law itself that gives us the authority to regulate that activity, or the law itself that says we don't regulate a given activity. So here I have outlined the two different acts that we predominantly use here in Minnesota. So we have Section 10 of the Rivers and Harbors Act, and this is the federal navigable waters. There's actually a list of navigable waters, the federal navigable waters, and these are like the really big waters. These are the Mississippi River, the St. Croix River, Lake Superior, those sorts of things. It is an actual defined list. We cannot add to that list, and we cannot subtract from that list. The interesting thing about the Rivers and Harbors Act, it was written in 1899, it was predominantly all about navigation. So once it was listed, if a water is no longer a water, like it was now converted to an upland, they built some sort of giant pier out over it, it is still on the list. That is still a navigable water where that pier now exists. So we now have the term sort of navigable in law. And what that basically means for you is work in that area that is part of the navigable water but is now fast to land still requires a permit. So that's the physical, the geographic jurisdiction under the Rivers and Harbors Act. Now the regulatory jurisdiction is, we sort of said, it's all work or structures in, over, under, or affecting that navigable water. So the Mississippi River, you want to directionally bore under it, you need a permit. You want to put something over it, like so a good example was the Super Bowl. There's a zip line that someone put over it for people who wanted to zip line across the Mississippi River in the cold. It sounds horrible to me. They need a permit. They applied for a permit because it was over the navigable water. And we have to, one of our missions as the Corps of Engineers is navigation. We have to protect that mission. So we evaluated it solely under Section 10. There was absolutely no work that occurred in the Mississippi River, but that's our activity-specific jurisdiction there. And then we have what we're all familiar with, the Clean Water Act, Section 404. And so the geographic jurisdiction of that we refer to as waters of the US. They're A1 through A7 waters, which currently may not mean anything to you. We have a couple slides that we're going to talk about what those actually are. And then we have, so if we determine, yes, it's geographically that wetland or waterway would be subject to our jurisdiction, we then have to evaluate, is the work you're doing in it subject to our jurisdiction? So, unlike the Rivers and Harbors Act, which is basically if you're touching it or even near it, you might need a permit. Under the Clean Water Act, it's the discharge of dredged or fill material. So, like an example of something that may not require a permit is if you're putting one post for a fence out in a wetland and you're just hammering that post in the ground, that probably doesn't constitute fill, and we may not be regulating that. Even though you're in the water that's subject to our jurisdiction, your activity itself is not a regulated activity. Didn't work the way I thought it would. So this is where we're going to talk about, we're predominantly going to focus on the Clean Water Act, because the Rivers and Harbors Act is just like everything. Super. So when we talk about the A1 through A7 waters, that's Clean Water Act language. That's what we talk about as waters of the United States. When you hear that term, that's a Clean Water Act term. So we have our traditional navigable waters, not to be confused with our federal navigable waters. We made it real confusing for everyone. So federal navigable waters are generally T&Ws. T&Ws do not have to be federally navigable waters. So these are predominantly, they're waters that were used or may be used or susceptible to use for interstate or foreign commerce. And then we have our interstate waters and wetlands, so the St. Croix River. State boundary, Columbia River between Washington and Oregon. It's an interstate water that falls under Clean Water Act jurisdiction. I'm going to come back to A3 in a minute. So A4 waters are those impoundments of waters that could otherwise be waters of the United States. So just because you built a dam across some creek doesn't mean then that the water above the dam wouldn't be subject to our jurisdiction. So an impoundment could still be subject to our jurisdiction. Tributaries to A1 through 4 waters. And I am going to expand on sort of what a tributary is in the next slide. Territorial seas, we don't deal with that here in our district, but those are waters of the United States. And then wetlands that are adjacent to any of these waters, A1 through 6. So let's talk about a little bit about A3 waters. A3 waters are sort of like this catch-all for if it's not an A1 through 7, it's these other intrastate waters. But they have to meet at least one of these 3 criteria. And so that first criteria is that it is or could be used for interstate or foreign recreational